As Paolo said, I'm Alex. I'm a speech and language therapist here at Great Ormond Street, and I'm also doing a research project with a fun acronym, much like the TOF study. My study is called SAFE. So it's looking at swallowing, feeding, and eating in children born with esophageal atresia. So what I'm going to talk to you, that SAFE project is made up of 4 different research projects. And some of you may well have been involved in some of the studies that we've already completed, so I thank you very much. TOFS have supported the recruitment to some of them. There's TOFS members on my steering committee, the PPI work that you were hearing about this morning. So I'm very grateful to TOFS, I'm very grateful to the steering group, and I'm very grateful to anybody who's taken part. So I'm going to talk to you about one of these projects that maybe isn't the most, I can't claim it to be cutting edge in the same way that Natalie's and Paolo's work is cutting edge, or the twin study, which sounds fantastic. But I'm hoping that it's more, when we're talking about that, the line of clinical research and basic lab-based research, mine is definitely at that end of the spectrum. So it's around, I guess, the functional, thinking about function. So the thing that I'm going to talk to you about today is one of the things that we do in research is gather all of the research that's already been done and try and pool it together to increase our understanding. So that's called a systematic review. Nigel talked about it this morning. He mentioned it. So I've done one of these systematic reviews that looks very specifically about eating, drinking, and swallowing problems in esophageal atresia. I really wanted to understand how common are they, because we all think that eating and drinking problems are maybe even universal in esophageal atresia, but also I was really interested in what exactly are they? Because when researchers and surgeons and everybody think about, they write their studies and they report their way of doing their surgery, and then one of the outcomes that is often reported is dysphagia, which is the medical term for swallowing problem. But actually, it's quite often in the literature, it's a bit vague as to what actually dysphagia is. So one of the things that I wanted to do was look and understand what's already been written about swallowing problems in this condition. So the first step is to do a trawl of the medical databases, all the journals that have already been, and that I didn't physically do that, but computers do it, and they churned up over 3,000 studies that apparently were related to esophageal atresia and swallowing problems. So then you have to read through all of the titles of those 3,500 papers and actually decide Tracheo-Oesophageal Fistula can also be caused by swallowing your dentures, and quite a few papers were written about swallowing your dentures, so they were turned out. I wasn't interested in those, although I'm making a mental note to myself to take care of the dentures should I ever need them. And we ended up with nearly 350 studies, which then you go through in detail, because they're the ones that actually might have some information that you want to understand, take out, to be able to pool together. So out of those nearly 3,500 studies, there were 65 that I thought, actually, they're really relevant to what I'm trying to understand. So then you go through each of those 65 and you pull out all the different relevant data so that you can pool it all together. And hopefully, because we trust information that's come from multiple sources more than we do just from a single study. So that's the process of a systematic review. So when we're thinking about swallowing, there are different ways that we can think about getting information. So we can ask you as the patient or the parent what you think are the problems with swallowing. So when I'm looking at this information, that's the first way I'm going to describe what swallowing problems are. So by these patient or parent reports. So just to explain these little tables. So along the top, or the second row down, is just the number of studies that we've pulled that data from. So you can see that we're going to say that the more studies there are, generally, the the more secure we are in thinking that that is a true result. And then the next one down is the range. So out of those studies who reported difficulty swallowing food, as that's how they described swallowing problems. So the range of some studies, the study with the lowest range, the lowest of prevalence, we call it, the lowest percentage of people with swallowing problems, is the first number, and then the second is the study with the highest number. Then we used some statistical analysis and we pooled them together. So that's what the bottom line is. So first off, we can see that there's quite a disparity between difficulty swallowing drinks and difficulty swallowing food, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to people in the room. But when we pooled it all together, about 45% of people with esophageal atresia report having problems swallowing food. We'll come back to that a little bit, which I don't know whether you think that's quite surprising or whether it's a bit low or a bit high, or but only 6% have problems swallowing drinks. 38% no problems with any sorts of food. So when you ask somebody, they say no, I don't have any problems. So those numbers quite catch up, but near enough. And yeah, coughing, around 20% of people coughing when they're eating, and 30% having substance. Hey, what age? Good question. It's across all ages. So these studies have been pulled from all ages of studies. So that's a really good question, and I will actually come back to it. Not in huge amounts of detail, but so the other way that you can think about swallowing difficulties is we could ask like the symptoms, I guess, of swallowing problems, but you can also think about it from the adaptations that people have to make to meal times. So you might not necessarily have cough or splutter when you're eating and drinking because you've made some adaptations. So it doesn't mean to say that you haven't got a swallowing problem, but you've adapted to it very nicely. So these are the next things that we looked at. And a lot of studies are reporting these types of things as an outcome. So they might be looking at their surgical outcomes, and they're then saying, well, this number of people. So we've got about 50% of people reporting that they regularly drink water when they're swallowing. Around 40% are eating slowly, or it might be that in a baby, it's their meal times are a little bit prolonged or very prolonged. But anything that we included in that, anything that means that meal times were sort of extended or eating slower, which might need to chew a little bit more. And then around 30% of people were modifying the types of food that they were eating. So needing to avoid certain foods or cook foods in a slightly different way. So that was a strategy that around 30% of people used it. And then the other thing that we can think about with eating and drinking is not just what's happening in the moment of eating and in the moment of swallowing, but what impact that has more psychologically. So psychologically on that person, and that person's ability to eat and drink in a social environment, or a parent's ability to, the likelihood that they're feeling very anxious when their baby's feeding. So these are more like the psychological, psychosocial things that happen as a result of a swallowing problem. So you can see that a lot fewer people are looking at this as an outcome. So actually only one of those 65 studies that we looked at was reporting this kind of thing, the psychosocial impact in an adult with OA. So it's a much less frequently studied phenomenon. And the one study that did found about 10% of people are actively avoiding social situations where they're having to go out to a restaurant or eat with friends or family. A couple more are looking at the parental anxiety associated with eating and drinking, and this is an area that I'm very passionate about. And one of the other projects that I've done is looking very specifically at this, and Fuoco is going to talk about it a bit later, so I'm going to move on. But around out of those three studies, around the third of parents were reporting really high anxiety around mealtimes. And then this one is challenging behaviour, as in food refusal. I don't like really to call it challenging behaviour, but that is what it is sort of referred to. But it's around children who find it, who have very restricted intake at all times. They might refuse foods, and there's a very good physiological reason for it, but it manifests itself in what we might call challenging behaviour. So I think if I was struggling to swallow food, I also would refuse to eat it. So I don't think it is challenging behaviour. I think it's quite sensible. So we can see we've got some information about the kind of swallowing problems or how these things might present. But why? What's causing it? So there was another systematic review that was done just a year or two ago, and they looked at esophageal problems, so problems in the food pipe. And morbidity just means a kind of problem, a difficulty. And they did a very similar pattern. They also had 65 studies, and they then came out with these. They analysed their data in a slightly different way to the way we did, but they reported on all these different things to do with the esophagus that might be causing those swallowing or those eating and drinking difficulties that I was talking about previously. So you can see with their range, it was huge. They've got everything from nobody has a problem with it to absolutely everybody has a problem. And that, I'm going to just bear that in mind, because I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But you can see that dysmotility, so that the inability of the food pipe to squeeze food down in that nice peristaltic manner. So dysmotility means a disruption to that movement of the esophagus. So food tends to stick in the esophagus a little bit longer, or instead of going smoothly down, it might go pop back up again and then go down again and then come up again and then go down again. So we can see from that around 3/4 of people on these studies look as if they've got some dysmotility. And then around 40%, as Raja was saying earlier, reflux, common, around 40% people have reflux or inflammation of the esophagus. 30% having strictures at some point. And then less common are leaks at the repair site, either with the fistula or the atresia. So those are all kind of esophageal type difficulties, but swallowing problems don't only happen down in the food pipe. And there's a speech and language there, because I'm particularly interested in swallowing problems that happen either caused by the mouth or the throat. And we can assess these in different ways, but the way that we looked at it in this systematic review was to look at something called instrumental assessment. So there was some sort of medical test that is done that will enable us to understand, like see inside, to give us a little bit more clear information about what's happening with swallowing. So the first picture here that we've got is a video fluoroscopy. You might be familiar with that. It's relatively commonly used in this country, an X-ray of the swallow. This is using an endoscope with a camera on the end of a wire to look down and understand swallowing. This is something that we've been using with the gastroenterology team here as part of my research, and it's using manometric size. So that's an aside, and I'd love to come and teach you about the results of that maybe next time. But when we look at these results, aspiration is what it's called when food or drink goes down the wrong way, and it's happening during swallowing. So it's not related to the esophagus. This is specifically looking at, as the child or the adult is swallowing, what's happening to it, and is it going the wrong way? And when they pulled that data, around 25% of people were having it go down the wrong way. Now, that figure to me is a little bit high, I think, because of the type of children that will have a video fluoroscopy. So not everybody has a video fluoroscopy. So only people who you think might have a problem tend to get a video fluoroscopy, which is why I think that figure looks a little bit inflated. But I think it's certainly higher than historically has been thought. That actually more people probably are having, more children have the difficulty swallowing up here than we might always recognise. Residue is when food and drink hangs around in the throat after you've swallowed. So around 10% are experiencing that. Delayed initiation gives us some idea as to why these problems might be happening, because it means that the swallow isn't starting at the right time. So swallowing should happen when the food and drink is quite high up in your throat and it's sitting in the throat before you start to swallow. So around a third who are having these tests are showing those signs. But again, no difficulties, around 50%, which is good news. So, let's skip through that actually, because it's not very, very interesting. But we can see that we've got all this information, but quite important questions remain. And I think one of the problems with the data that we've got is those ranges are really quite big. They go from very small numbers to very big numbers. And that is because it matters how you measure what you're doing. Whether you ask somebody in an interview or using a questionnaire, whether that questionnaire has been specifically designed for that purpose or whether you're just asking them a random question, the way that you measure that swallowing problem, that eating and drinking difficulty, it really matters to what answer you're getting. Much like Rebecca was talking about in that core outcome set, until we've got an agreed way of assessing it, we're always going to have this bit of variation. And who you measure matters. So age is potentially a really important factor. So, but out of all of, we did look at age, but not very many studies report by age group. They're often quite big age ranges, like looking at children from 0 to 18, or everybody, children and adults. So it's very difficult for us to pull out the effect of age on these outcomes. And it also matters who that person is from, where they've been, where they've come from in the research. So is the research done on people only who are in tertiary hospitals, in specialist hospitals? So they might have potentially more difficulties than somebody who's in a non-specialist centre who might not be accessing those things. So in understanding the sort of prevalence, how frequently these bonds arise, it does matter whom we measure. And thinking about the type of OA, a lot of these studies included everybody. It doesn't matter the type of esophageal atresia they had. So it's quite difficult for us to pull apart what is maybe more in a long gap or a short gap or different types of surgical repair. Lots and lots of different questions that mean those percentages that we're getting. We still need to, we're questioning them. And actually for a lot of these things, particularly the psychological outcomes, particularly around eating and drinking and how easy is it for people to go to a family Christmas dinner and enjoy it, versus, those sorts of questions we really don't have the answers to. So in terms of how does that relate to what we're talking about today and improving care? Well, I think all of this information, we know that eating, drinking and swallowing problems are really complex in people with esophageal atresia. And there could be many different interacting factors, dysmotility, strictures, pharyngeal problems. They all kind of interact, and it can be difficult to unpick what that underlying cause is. So it's really important that we work as a team. I can see some of the teams sat there at the back, and actually working together in a specialist and multidisciplinary team where everybody in the team has got these specialist knowledge and skills is important to improve outcome.